Azure offers the capability to establish a secure connection using an Azure Private Endpoint, which allows you to access your Azure SQL Server securely within the virtual network. In this training module, we'll explore the connection of an Azure SQL Server using the Azure Private Endpoint in the Azure portal, ensuring that your database connections are secure and isolated. By the end of the module, you'll understand the importance of using Azure Private Endpoint to establish that secure connection to the Azure SQL Server. You'll learn how to configure and create an Azure Private Endpoint for the Azure SQL Server in the portal. You'll gain insights into the networking architecture and the components involved in setting up an Azure Private Endpoint. Understanding how to isolate and test the connections between the Azure Private Endpoint as well as the SQL Server, as well as recognizing the benefits of using Azure Private Endpoints for securing database connections, isolating network traffic, and the like, as well as other services other than SQL. Let's get into this. Azure Private Endpoint is a network interface that connects you privately and securely to a service powered by Azure Private Link. It uses a private IP address from your virtual network, ensuring that traffic between your virtual network and the service remains within the Azure backbone network, avoiding exposure to the public internet. It ensures a private connection to the Azure service, such as Azure Storage, Azure SQL databases, and other Azure services. It enhances security by eliminating exposure to the public internet as well as other network services and reduces the risk of data breaches. It integrates seamlessly with the Azure networking infrastructure, allowing for easy management and configuration. You'll want to implement private endpoints for services that handle sensitive or critical data to ensure secure and private communications. In a layered security approach, you'll also use network security groups or NSGs, as well as Azure firewalls to further control and monitor traffic to and from your private endpoints. And as with everything, periodically, you'll want to review and update your private endpoint configurations to ensure that they meet your security and compliance requirements. Imagine if you had a SQL Server database that stores sensitive customer information. By using a private endpoint, you can ensure that only resources within your virtual network can access the database. This setup prevents unauthorized access from the public internet or other networks, significantly enhancing the security of your data. Azure Private Link Service allows you to securely connect to Azure services such as Azure Storage and SQL databases and your own services over the private endpoint within your virtual network. This ensures that traffic between your virtual networks and those services remains on the Microsoft backbone, avoiding that exposure to other networks and the public internet. It establishes the private connection to Azure services, ensuring that it remains within the Azure network. It allows you to control and monitor the exposure of your services by enabling the private access only. And enables alias and connection management by supporting a globally unique alias, which can be shared with consumers and customers to initiate private connections. You can manage and approve connection requests to the service. You'll also want to implement Azure Private Link Service for applications handling sensitive or critical data to enhance their security. And like other services, we recommend that you want to make sure that you use it in conjunction with network security groups and firewalls for that layered approach and monitor the traffic for the necessary requirements and updates to the private link service and the configurations to ensure they meet your sensitive and security compliance requirements. I want to take a look at the various levels of these services so you can understand the terms, because they all sound the same. So let's go to a whiteboard and talk about the various ways in which you can network connect to a service inside of Azure securely. What I've drawn here is an example of either a service or a user, whether it be public or private, whether it be on premises, it doesn't really matter, but you've got a network segment on the left-hand side of the screen. And in my case, I've drawn 3 SQL databases on the right-hand side. You'll see SQL 1 and SQL 2 are drawn in black, and I got SQL 3 drawn in red. I did that specifically because what I wanted to do was to represent not just 3 different databases, but these black versus the red ones could be in different regions. They could be in different resource source groups, it doesn't matter, but I really wanted to separate because I want to talk about a service versus the database itself. Now, absolutely, I could take a SQL Server and install a SQL Server on the network segment. And if I had a user or I had some application running on a server or workstation, they could absolutely access that database because they're on the same network segment. We've talked about this through other portions of this course about how you control that traffic with NSGs as well as with firewalls. Now, that's pretty simple, but we've also talked that you might want to take a look at a three-tiered architecture, sometimes referred to in the industry as an N-tiered architecture, that you want to separate the front end, the middle tier, and the back end. And again, we could use that subnetting and NSGs to do that work for us. Now, in the case of SQL, we have SQL as a server where you could install an IaaS or infrastructure as a service virtual machine and install SQL. But whether it be that or whether it be a SQL server running as a platform as a service where Microsoft hosts the infrastructure and you just maintain the database structure and the data within it. So what we have is, and you're going to see down the left-hand side of the, or the right-hand side of the screen, I'm going to refer to this as services. Because while we're focusing on this module by name and connecting to SQL, this applies to any Azure service. We mentioned in the course that it could be a storage account, it could be other applications, and so this is not limited to specifically SQL servers. Now, I could actually connect, and as I said, install the SQL server on the network. I could have a network segment and then do the wiring together from routing networks and VNet peering to connect them. But if this is, say, running as a service, I could create a thing called a service endpoint. Now, a service endpoint will allow my network segment and any service on this network service or network segment to connect to the service. So a service endpoint exposes an Azure service, whether it be the Azure Storage Service, whether it be the Azure SQL Service. It's going to expose the totality of that service to the network. And so now I could connect to a SQL server maintained as a service within inside of Azure, but it's not just one of them. I could connect to all of the services. And it's up to you to pick the right one and limit it. But it's not going to be this secure, dedicated connection that we've been talking about in this module. So as a service endpoint, I'm going to expose an entirety of an Azure service to a network segment. We then want to take a look at a private endpoint. And that's where we spent most of our time, and I believe I actually covered this in a previous module where we talked about a private endpoint. And so what a private endpoint is a one-to-one relationship. It is going to create a relationship between a network card or an IP address, and that basically creates a virtual network card on that network segment that gets an IP address on that network segment and ties it to a specific instance of the service. So again, the difference between a service endpoint and a private endpoint, one has a one-to-one and one has a one-to-many relationship. And so now this way I could call the IP address of the private endpoint and be able to dedicate a connection using TLS or HTTPS to connect to that service. And any other traffic coming to these other SQL servers are not going to get convoluted with the traffic that I've got. So a private endpoint is going to provide that capability for me. So that's what you want to take a look at. Now, a private endpoint service is going to be slightly different. And then I'm going to go back to the slides for just a second and talk about it. In here, very similar to, if you take a look at what's a private endpoint versus a private link versus a private link service, they're all variations of a similar theme. So the private endpoint refers to, as you'll see on the right or left-hand side of the slide, that refers to the representation of that service as a network attachable component, IP address, that exists within the network segment that you want it to appear in. We then get the private link service that is going to provide that connection. And now as a private endpoint, it's a one-to-one that I was talking about. But a private link service is slightly different. As opposed to a one-to-one component, a private link service is going to, as you see here, going to be able to connect me to a service. And this is often done by service providers where they're probably going to aggregate a number of components. It could be a SQL Server, maybe a business application that combined together provide a service that they're going to make available through that endpoint. So it's a slightly different version, all similar flavors of the same thing. So you've got service endpoints, private links, private link services that can get a little confusing. But hopefully that describes for you the various versions of these private connections. And that's the key here, a private connection between a service running in one subnet or a series of users or applications connecting to some other service within inside of Azure. And again, all of this relates back to your Microsoft Defender for Cloud because these connections can be monitored and identified as a compliance requirement, and then you could then report that in Microsoft Defender for Cloud to make sure that you can, for either regulatory requirement components or even security requirements within your organization, that these configurations have been properly set up and maintained, making sure that we've got a secure environment for our data and our applications to run. So we're going to jump off into a small example here where the exercise, if you want to follow along, as we've done with the other modules, and we'll just step through the creation of a private endpoint. So I'm back in the Azure portal, and I want to demonstrate not just the exercise components, but something I showed. So I'm going to show two things, the service endpoint and the private endpoint connections that you're working with. The exercise that follows this lab specifically is quite complicated where you're creating virtual machines and bastion networks to provide a connection to the services that you can monitor, and takes quite a while. So I'm going to leave that on your own, but I'm going to do, for all intents and purposes, an effective demonstration that will show you the two of them. Now, the one that is not part of the course or the lab is that thing I mentioned before called a service endpoint, where I was going to expose an entire service of Azure, whether it be a SQL service, whether it be the storage service. I'm going to be able to make that service available to the network without having to build a network infrastructure for that. So in this case, I'm going to come to an existing VNet that I've already created. And so I'm going to go back to VNet 1 that we've used before, and I'm going to come under the settings component. And so now what I'm going to do is come into my network, my service endpoints. And in here, I'm going to be able to add a service endpoint to this VNet. And I just say add a service. And here you're going to get the list of the entirety of Azure services that I can connect to. So what I've got is, if I come to the Azure storage service, by selecting this, I can now expose any device on this VNet. So I might have virtual machines, I might have applications that are running there. Any device that is a portion of this VNet would then be able to have access to the storage service. I can have policies that come along with this. I can tie it down to, because you remember, this is done at the VNet level, and you might have multiple subnets. So maybe I only want a subnet in the VNet to have this. So this can be limited to a specific subnet within the VNet, but by saying add, it's going to go through and add the service. Now what I've got is I've got a storage account that I've created that if I wanted to gain access to, so I'm going to come back into my storage accounts. So I've got a service endpoint demo storage account. So this is where I can store files. This could have been a SQL Server if I wanted. But under the storage account, under networking, you can see I have the firewall rules. So we've talked about this in other modules, configuring the firewall rules at the service, and you can allow access in or out. Now, this is separate from a traditional firewall that you might put on your network to control public-private ingress and egress. This is around the service, and we talked about this in a previous module about enabling the firewall on something like Key Vault. So this is a firewall specific to, in this case, this service of my storage account. Now, I can enable that, or I can come to this thing called a private endpoint. That's what this lesson's actually about. I didn't have to create the service endpoint because that's done at the VNet to the service, but I could actually connect to this service of this storage account and access its components by going to that network segment and having it access the storage account. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back to my network for just a second. I'm going to create a private endpoint connection to this storage account. So I want to go back to the VNet. And in the VNet, you can actually see the connected devices. So I've currently got 2 network cards. I've got the virtual machines that I have in that VNet. So I've got 2 VMs that are connected, and those are the virtual network cards associated with those VMs. And you can see the IP addresses. Make note of that, so you're going to see them appear here in just a second. So I'm going to go back to my storage account. I'm going to come into my networking, and I'm now going to create a private endpoint. I'm going to create a private endpoint called, I'm going to call this a SC-5002. You'll see the network card name. The region is in US West. What service do I want? So I'm going to take I can have my table storage. I'm not going to get into a storage account, but I can access blob storage, all of it. So I'm going to just go to blob. Do I want it to happen across all of them? I can actually, we talked about in a previous lesson, application security groups. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm not going to set up DNS tags, but I'm going to create this. Now this will take a second, and once it's done, we'll come back and I'm going to go back to that network segment. Remember, we had 2 virtual network cards that were in that network segment representing the network cards associated with the virtual machines that were associated with it. So I'll see you back here in a second. So welcome back. It took about maybe 5 minutes, a little bit longer, but not too long, but we've been able to create these resources. And remember, in the storage account, we created that private endpoint. And so here is the private endpoint that was created. It gives me the information about what resource it was created in, what was the subscription it was billed to. But I'm going to go back to the VNet itself, and you'll see, if I get into my connected devices, you'll see that I had this previously 2 VNet or network cards at 4 and 5, and you can see now I've got another network card that represents that service that if I were to address 10.0.0.6 on that network segment that these 2 are, I would be able to connect to that storage account. And so without knowing the name of the storage account, by going to the IP address, I could access the storage account and the resources in it. And that same thing would have happened if it was SQL. So I could change the backend entirety. I could change it from one storage account to another, but the application that was in this VNet wouldn't have to change because it would access it using the same IP address. So hopefully that gives you an example of what that's going to do for you from an endpoint perspective. So we've seen how a service endpoint and a private endpoint have been able to be added to my networks to be able to access it. The private link service as a SaaS provider, or even internally to your own organization on a broad range, you can provide a multi-tenanted application hosted in Azure. By using an Azure Private Link service, you can allow your customers to connect to your service privately through their own virtual networks. This setup ensures that all communications between your customers' networks and your services is secure and isolated from the public internet, providing an additional layer of security and trust. So that brings us to the end of this module, as well as to the end of this lesson and learning path for SC-5002. And we've done this in relationship to looking at compliance and governance, which is being done through Microsoft Defender for Cloud as a tool that can deploy governance and compliance checking across your infrastructure and get that reporting back and identify potential issues as well as possible remediation. We then spent quite a bit of time looking at the various services and their configurations and the type of compliance that you would be able to assign to those so that they can be reported back into Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So remember, to provide that governance and compliance that you might need either internally to your organization or either for government regulation or industry regulations, these features all work together from deploying the services in a specific configuration to be compliant, and then using something like Microsoft Defender for Cloud to collect the telemetry and the metric and log data information and the configuration values into either the Azure monitoring tool and a workspace using the AMA, or whether we use a log analytics workspace to be able to collect that information. We collect it, digest that information, and then check it for compliance. So all of that together is what you're looking for to provide that data governance and compliance requirements. Thank you for joining me in this series. Hopefully you found it interesting. I hope to see you again in another learning path available for you on the Microsoft Learn site.